All right, so this is Unit 2, Presentation 1, and this one's all about culture. So this is going to hit all the basic things you need to know about culture, and then in this unit we'll be getting into more of the details. So we'll kind of break it down and get into religion and talk about that separately, and then government and economics and things like that. But with this, we'll just hit kind of the big overview. So obviously, culture, is the way in which we live and do things and things we believe, customs we have, and things like that. And obviously, cultures can change, and they do change over time due to internal and external influences. So, for example, contacts like that could be, people traveling to different places and stuff like that. Can bring about new ideas and changes in culture. And of course, migration, people moving into an area over time can change the culture as well as they bring different ideas with them. Kind of like the Irish as they moved into the U.S. Brought their traditions, and eventually what we do for Halloween now basically came from them and bringing their ideas and traditions into this country. And then you have barriers. You have things that block cultures from interacting and or having contact with others. And this could be like deserts, kind of like how we talked about with the Sahara Desert blocking North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, that's a natural barrier. And then you can have human barriers. These could be obviously like a wall, but besides that, it could be prejudice. It could be things that to where you don't want to interact with another culture because you're afraid of that group or you don't understand them, or whatever it may be. Any prejudice can obviously keep cultures from interacting and having any kind of change through that. And then you have far-reaching changes. These are huge changes in a culture that impact well beyond the initial change. So the Renaissance, for example, it started in Italy in the 1400s. Well, that had a giant change on Western culture, and really the shift that created in Western culture, we are still seeing the effects of that today, over 500 years later. And so, there's big shifts that can occur within a culture and really kind of change the direction a culture is going. So, like I said, cultures, obviously, I mean, they include so much more than, religion and language and stuff like that. It's the work we do and how we work. It's all the little behaviors we have. I mean, it's all the little things you don't really think about as far as how we just interact with each other day to day. The little ways of doing things, it could be from the way we sleep, how many hours we sleep, when we eat, what we wear, what we do in the morning to get ready. All those things can be part of culture. And that's all what we call cultural traits. Of course, your big features of culture, though, are going to be social groups, language, and religion. Those are your big features, but traits are going to be all those smaller things that we'll be talking about as well. All right, so first off, you need to know what a society is. So, a society is a group of people that share a region and a sense of identity and a culture. So, we in the United States, we, share a region, we live in the same area. We have a sense of identity that's going to come from our shared history, which is, part of why you take history classes, is that shared history that we have together. So, for example, you talk to any American about 9/11, like we share that as Americans, the impact that had on us. And so that's something that's not forgotten. Or World War II or anything that's happened in our past is part of our identity and part of what makes us who we are. And then, of course, that shapes our culture. So that's what all that creates, what we know as is the American society. And then ethnic groups. So you need to know the difference between race and ethnicity. So race basically comes down to color of skin and stuff like that. Ethnicity does not. Ethnicity is a group of people that share language, customs, and a common heritage. So, for example, like if I asked what ethnicity you are, you wouldn't just say, "Oh, I'm white" or "I'm black" or anything like that. You would say specifically what you are. So, for example, if your background comes from Europe, then you would say specifically like where in Europe, like you German or Irish, or maybe some of the smaller groups like Basque and stuff like that. So that would be your ethnic group. So you share language, customs, and a common heritage. So it's not your race, it's not your skin tone or anything like that. It has to do with what culture you go back to. All right, social groups. So the most basic social group in any culture is the family. That is the foundation of a culture. And so whenever you see cultures where family is falling apart, you tend to see issues within that culture. And so when I say families falling apart, like as far as not having a stable family life at home, and so divorced families, things like that, single parent homes, you're going to see more issues in culture because of that. If you look at most of the people in the prison system, most of them came from families without two parents. They came from what we would call broken homes. And so family is the basic, most important foundational social group. It's key for a culture to be successful. You need a successful family. All right, so as far as when we're talking about family, of course, in different cultures, that can mean different things. So we do break it up. We have the nuclear family, so that's your parents and the children, and so that's who you live in the house with. And of course, it's extended family, so grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, relatives, and stuff like that. And again, you have a cultural difference here. So here in the U.S., we tend to mainly focus on the nuclear family, and obviously, you probably hang out with your grandparents some. But in other cultures, the family is everyone. It's all your cousins, your second cousins, your third cousins, the guy down the street that you might be related to. It's all family, and so you live all close to each other, and you hang out together and do everything together. Some cultures are like that, and ours is not as much. All right, and then you have matriarchy and patriarchy. So matriarchy is where the eldest woman in the family is in charge and guides the family. And there are places in the world like this. It's not nearly as many as compared to a patriarchy, but a matriarchy, we've seen that in some ethnic groups within India. And a patriarchy is where the man is in charge, the oldest man in the family. And that is very much still around today in different cultures, some much more strongly than others. All right, other elements of culture, another term, some more terms you need to know. So next term is innovation. So this is where you take an existing technology or resource and you create something new to meet a new need. And so cultures innovate to fix whatever need we have at the time. So down here at the bottom of this slide, you see the innovation of communication. The ability to communicate from pots in ancient Greece that carried things and traded. The Pony Express here in the U.S. For a little while to get mail across the country, and then the telegraph, then the telephone, and of course the telephone has evolved over time. So all that's a form of innovation. It's taking something, which is communication, but then improving the way in which we communicate over time. Cultural hearth. Think of a hearth as like a cradle. So this is where innovation first occurs. It's the beginning of civilization. So it's where civilization first started. So basically, our cultural hearths are Egypt along the Nile River, Tigris-Euphrates River in Mesopotamia, the Indus River Valley in India, and along the Huanghe and Yangtze rivers in China. And you can also include some in Central America as well as being a cultural hearth. So that's where our first civilizations ever started, was in those areas. And so from there, culture, of course, developed and then spread and developed over time. And all the inventions and things they discovered there eventually spread over time. And we've continued to innovate on top of those things that they discovered. Diffusion, of course, is these ideas spreading, these inventions spreading from the cultural hearth to all these areas that they've gone to. And acculturation is when a society decides to accept or adopt an innovation. So we could take something simple like clothing. So I mentioned before how jeans were invented here in the U.S. Um, well, eventually, they've spread around the world. So when other cultures came in contact with jeans and people wearing jeans, and then they decided, what, those look comfortable. I'd like to wear a pair of jeans. That's acculturation. As the culture brings it in, not just one person, but a whole culture brings it in, makes it part of their own. And that's going to be, you will get that confused with assimilation, which we'll talk about later. All right, and then language. Obviously, we've already talked some about language on the last unit and how it's really key to understanding a culture and what they value and things like that. And obviously, it's how they communicate. But keep in mind, that we could be speaking the same language but have different dialects. And so you may still not be able to understand someone speaking English if they're using a different dialect than you. For example, like in England, like when they say, cookies, they mean biscuits or what we would consider a biscuit. If you say a biscuit, you're getting a cookie. Crisp, or of course, chips, and chips or French fries. And so there's all these, words that, mean different things there because of the dialect. And then, of course, we have written language, and not every culture has a written language. A lot of them do, but not all of them do. And some have more than one written languages, and some of them, the written language is not related at all to the spoken language, like with Mandarin. You can speak Chinese and not know how to write it. You can know how to write Chinese and not know how to speak it. They're two separate things. And then body language. And so there's going to be certain things with body language as well that are cross-cultural and pretty much global, like a smile or something like that. But there's going to be certain things too, and things that we do that maybe here would be normal and not a big deal, but in other cultures could be very, very that would it would basically offend them greatly. Certain things that we may do here that we see as normal. So, and in class, of course, I'll show you some extra stuff about that. All right. So as far as body language, though, because about 85% of all communication is body language. And like I said, every culture is different when it comes to this and how they communicate. And so there's certain things that are cross-cultural and pretty much global, like a smile, and stuff like that, and dress nice. Like people are going to see that as nice and welcoming and opening and stuff like that. And here down here, we see Trump with his arms crossed and everyone kind of looking around him. Like you can kind of get the feel for the room just looking at there, and that's leaders of different countries come all around him. And Trump, obviously looks like I don't care what you're saying, Angela Merkel. And then up top you got the officer yelling at the soldier there, and he or the well, Navy, whatever you call him, the Navy, the sailor. There we go. So yeah, so he's like yelling at the sailor there, and you can see the sailor being stern, kind of clenching his jaw. Obviously, the officer was a bit angry, and then of course you got the way like where you can tell that couple there is probably dating just based on the way that they're holding each other. And then down here on the bottom right, you have offices. So the first one, the top one is the North American office, bottom one is the Japanese office. So here in the U.S., for example, we separate the boss and the employees, whereas in Japan they work together, the boss and employees together. And that also is cultural, very cultural. Where here we kind of see our boss as like, oh no, our boss, but in Japan, the boss is someone that works with him, and so the Japanese office tends to be much more efficient because of that as well. Our religion, I'm not going to really spend much time on this at all here because we're going to spend a solid 2 days on religions. But religions obviously help people understand the world, find comfort, faith, and strength, and is really good because it helps cultures be resilient whenever bad things happen and stuff like that. And of course, not everyone's religious. And even though a culture may be, majority of people in that culture may be religious, obviously it doesn't mean they all are. But your five main religions, the ones that we'll be talking about in depth later on, are Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Judaism. And Judaism, we mentioned because it's obviously had a big impact in history. But as far as size, though, there's not that many Jews. There's only about 16 million compared to 2.5 billion Christians, 1.5 billion Muslims. So it is quite tiny as far as the amount of people that follow it. All right, moving on. So these are universal elements of culture. So otherwise known as the ABCs of culture, basically. So this is just all the other things that we haven't really mentioned. So again, it permeates in everything. So art, music, dance, crafts, the way we entertain ourselves, economics. Like our economic system is based on our culture and it reflects our culture. Occupations, what kind of jobs we have, what jobs are respected, what jobs are not respected, and how we make a living. Education and technology, how's education valued and looked upon? How's technology used and implemented within a culture? The history of a culture and how do we feel about that history? Our ancestry, do we really pay attention to where we come from and stuff like that and our ancestors? Some really almost worship their ancestors, like in East Asia, and the rest of us, may just be like, oh, I don't know where I came from. My parents had me and I'm here. Holidays that we celebrate, other celebrations that we have, important dates. Ideology, it's basically the way we see the world, our worldview, our belief systems, rules of conduct. How do we behave in public? How do we behave at home? Those sorts of things. Our values that we have and share. Our government. What is our government like? What do we expect from our government? Do we trust our government? Shelter or housing, how do we live? How big are our houses? How small are the houses? Do we live in apartments? Do we have yards? Do we live, all spread out? Is everything all built together and stuff like that? So there's so many elements to it. And then other things, just there's so many. So facial expressions, which we kind of hit with body language, religious beliefs and rituals, which we hit. Importance of time, culture to culture. That's very different here. Where it's all about time, especially at work. You have to be on time at work. But in other cultures, it's not as important. And as I mentioned, the arts, morals and values, child raising beliefs, the gestures we use, what is fair, what's a good leader, what makes a good friend, what's considered modest and what's not modest. the foods that we eat, and eating habits. What's considered rude, not rude? Is it okay to burp at the end of your meal? Concept of self and importance of beauty. What is beauty? Who decides what beauty is? How have we, like, how is that created? Because that's very much a cultural thing. Because what we may see is beautiful in our culture, another culture may look at it and be like, ah, that's not beautiful at all. Style of dress, general worldview and understanding the world, how we understand it. Concept of personal space, rules of social etiquette, what we expect in public, what we expect from other people. That's a simple thing like standing in line. Like we know how to stand in line. A lot of cultures, they don't stand in line at all. They just a mob to get to whatever you want. And so it's little things like that you don't really pick up until you kind of travel and you see it firsthand. And then you try to adapt to it. And so there's culture is in everything, all around you. So again, it's not just language, it's not just religion. Those big things. It's literally every little thing you can imagine is part of your culture somehow. All right, and this is just for fun. This is just different eggs they eat in different cultures, or different eggs, different foods they eat in different cultures, and eggs being one of them. Bats, bird's nest soup, which is a delicacy in China and other parts of East and Southeast Asia. Blubber, from walruses and whales. Cockroaches in Thailand. Flies all throughout Asia. Kangaroo, which I mentioned I've eaten. Scorpions, you get scorpions on a stick, tarantulas, things like that. And then I won't go on, but basically that's it when it comes to culture. So those are the big ideas, but make sure you understand the key terms that we went over, and things like that. And of course, your big ideas as far as what makes up culture and how cultures change as they interact with one another, and what can keep cultures from changing or interacting. All right, so that's it for culture.